Hello, and welcome to the first episode of my Demon's Souls Compare-Through. This is a spin-off from my Demon's Souls Dissected series, where I'm going to go through every area of the game to explore the environments and see how things got redesigned for the remake. We'll be doing a bunch of exploration out of bounds to get a better idea of how much work went into fleshing out the environments. Unfortunately, the tools for a proper out-of-bounds exploration of the remake don't exist yet, of course, but we'll be abusing photo mode as much as we can along the way. And I'm also going to be taking this opportunity to show off a bunch of weird stuff. Even if you've been a fan of this game for a long time, I feel pretty confident that I can show some oddities that you've never seen before. Do note that this isn't intended to be a proper comparison of the graphics, as I'll be running the original Demon's Souls in emulation, at an upscaled resolution and improved frame rate. I'm more interested in artistic changes, and seeing the new assets compared to the old. And I'd prefer to show the original Demon's Souls in a sort of best-case scenario, rather than worry about demonstrating its performance on PS3 accurately. So we'll start things off from the very beginning, the tutorial, also known as the Journey to the Nexus.
Brave soul who fears not death.
Brave soul who fears not death.
I shall guide you.
I shall guide you to the fissure,
So that you may lull the old one back to slumber.
so that you may lull the old one back to slumber.
Alright, so right off the bat we can see how much more detail there is in the environment of the remake. But there's a good chance you've already seen some side-by-side comparisons like this. For a good chunk of what I'm going to be looking at, I'm more interested in what's on the periphery. Manipulating our placement to go out of bounds will make it abundantly clear just how much their workload increased by including the photo mode in the remake. Sometimes it's constrained by invisible walls and various bits of collision, but it has a surprising amount of freedom that would get us into trouble very quickly in the original, where we'd see how the content dead ends much sooner. Back here at the starting tunnel, there's a few pillars poking up from out of bounds, but otherwise it's pretty barren out here. The remake gets rid of the pillars but flushes out the surrounding land and puts some trees out there. Over in this direction, we can see that they've added the ruins of another building, where there was also nothing previously. Turning to the right, we can see an out-of-bounds structure here in the original, but once again, a closer look reveals that it cuts off almost immediately as soon as we get too high. We can see more of the surrounding land in the remake, and one creepy environmental addition comes in the form of a noose hanging from a nearby tree. I would be remiss not to mention the obvious stylistic change. The columns and perfectly flat roof of the original manages to feel a bit more Roman, I think? I'm not the most qualified person to recognize and identify various architecture throughout history, but the original feels like it comes from a different time and place. I know these sorts of changes will be upsetting to some, and if you already find this frustrating, you might want to buckle up because there's going to be a lot of this in the remake. That being said, I really only have like a short list of maybe 6 specific things throughout the whole game that I felt really strongly about. My overall impression of the remake is very positive, and I'm okay with most of these sorts of changes. There's a particular charm to the look of the original, but there are a lot of strengths and good ideas that the remake brings to the table as well. Not everything is bad, simply because the vibe has changed a little. Okay, but that's enough defending the remake, let's get back to exploring. Of course there are more objects added about, but I'm not going to stop to point out every little new object that was added unless there's something more noteworthy about how a particular set piece was filled out. But I would like to talk about how we can find some more boxes sitting out of bounds nearby in the original. What are these doing out here? Well, an earlier prototype version of the tutorial reveals a wall of boxes blocking your path at the end of the tunnel. This might have been an opportunity to teach the player about breaking objects or vaulting, but I'll talk a little bit more about vaulting later. Ultimately, they decided against it, and I'd be willing to bet that the boxes we find out of bounds are what became of this. They wound up clearing this first area out entirely, but it's kind of like the remake splits the difference by adding some back in and placing them off to the side. Here's one small difference that's not really of any consequence, but I still thought it was interesting. Turning around, we can see the top of the starting tunnel was open in the original, but it has a closed ceiling until we reach the first clearing in the remake. Moving forward, a see-through gate allows us to see more stuff that wasn't there before. We can get a better view from over here. For some reason, I'm particularly fond of the partially open doors on that out-of-bounds structure. It's a lot of detail and looks very pretty for a location we can't get to, and one that we can't see clearly at all without photo mode. Moving on to the next area, there's a very simple 2D texture for the wall containing the next room. It almost looks unfinished, like there should be some kind of rooftop, but it just abruptly and cleanly cuts off. Going higher up shows that they really did the minimal amount of work to convey the facade of the structure. Unsurprisingly, there's more detail in the remake, but we did lose something kind of neat, which was the weird rooftop to this connecting passage. I like the sloped roof and the relief of a star, or whatever that is. Though to be fair, the remake did add this other circular relief in a few places, which was likely inspired by that previous design. This next room demonstrates a recurring technique found throughout the remake, where they kept the traversable game space mostly the same as the original, but added nooks that are purely visual. There's this plain wall here on the right, which gets opened up and has some stuff added in. The same goes for this wall at the far end, where they added a storage space. And there's some newfound ceiling storage as well. This all keeps the walkable map space pretty much identical to the original, which is important. Earlier they added some objects into a walkable space that weren't there previously, but thankfully this is something they did somewhat sparingly. They didn't just throw a bunch of extra crap everywhere. If they did, the environment would have gotten cluttered in a way that it wasn't previously. They did manage to avoid that for the most part, relegating a lot of the extra visual elements to things that don't physically get in your way or block your view. Now, to immediately contradict what I just said, I find it interesting that you can walk over this object in the original, but you can't in the remake. I feel like this is the exception to the rule, though, where the walkable space almost always remains entirely the same. Let's take a closer look at some characters. It might just be the natural result of having more detail, but the Dreglings feel a bit more humanized in the remake. In the original, it almost felt like they could be an entirely different group of people from the soldiers. But now it feels a bit more like they could be the same people, perhaps a lower class, and, maybe they're just further down the path of being soul-starved for too long. I think the audio might play a role here, where in the original they sounded a bit more monster or zombie-like. Not that some of their sounds in the remake aren't a bit over the top as well. And a quick observation about what they're wearing. The clothes may have changed a little bit, but they're still wearing those wooden boards on their chest. I have to imagine that makes for some pretty poor armor. We also have a ghost seen running up the staircase, which is something you don't really see as much of in later Souls games. Sure, you see plenty of player ghosts, but this is an offline ghost. It's not generated by someone online, and it's guaranteed to appear on a fixed loop. Demon's Souls has a few of these throughout the game, sometimes pointing out helpful things, like the levers in Stonefang. What we see here is more than just a visual animation. Remember that NPCs in Demon's Souls will turn their heads to look at you. We can see the ghost look in our direction. This first time it looks towards its left. And now that we're on the other side of the staircase, we'll see it look right. This is our first indication that there's an actual entity of some kind here, and that's not purely a visual effect. We can mess with his character type to make him come fully into view. We can also mess with his team type to make him hostile to the enemies in the environment, and get him to kill some Druglings for us. Thank you, ghost friend. But now that we no longer have a use for him, we can also even kill him by directly modifying his HP to 0. They did clean his behavior up in the remake, though, where he does ignore us properly instead of turning his head to look at us. Okay, let's continue on. They added an extra space back here that you can see into. Unsurprisingly, there's nothing back here in the original. So here's the sort of money shot of the tutorial, where so much was added and it makes for a really striking moment. I don't have too much to say in terms of a direct comparison, because of how different they are. One important difference in terms of world building is found in the inclusion of the Boletarian insignia in the remake. The design of this insignia is borrowed from the original game, however it wasn't previously found anywhere in the tutorial. Once again, purists might feel a little uncomfortable with these kinds of liberties being taken by Bluepoint, but I think it's a perfectly justifiable addition. If we were truly meant to be somewhere far away and completely distinct, it wouldn't make a lot of sense for there to be Boletarian soldiers occupying the place. So identifying this area as something like a Boletarian outpost is an understandable design change. And it's even reflected in the name change. The tutorial wasn't named at all in the original, it was simply known as the Journey to the Nexus. But now all of the individual locations have new names, and it is being referred to as an outpost. I like how the remake adds this kind of detailed landing nearby that's out of bounds. It includes some breakable and movable objects, and I find it oddly satisfying to interact with things that are out of reach. Upon closer inspection, this architecture doesn't make a lot of sense. We can see that there aren't any other paths or doorways up here, so the stairs don't really lead anywhere, and no one would be walking around out there. But they didn't likely intend for us to look this closely. For this closed-off path here, they added sounds of the Vanguard demon off in the distance, which is a really nice touch. In the original, we can go out of bounds to see a short path that extends beyond the closed gate. There's a darker segment that goes straight ahead into a dead end, but it's connected to a path that ramps upwards, and it all has collision. I'll come back to this a little later, but I'll just say for now that the implications of this design are really cool, and I think I might blow some minds in a few minutes here. Out of bounds and off to the right, we have this area below. There's a couple trees on one side, some water flowing through, and one more tree on the other side. I like how faithful they were in keeping this unreachable area pretty much identical. One small difference is that in the original, this area is raised above the water level below, and there's like a bit of a waterfall there. In the remake, it makes it all level to the water, which makes a bit more sense to me. There's also an extra patch of land nearby, instead of all just open water. In the distance, we have the ruins of some kind of bridge. In the remake, it curves in towards this area. I think the idea was to put some of these ruins a bit closer, so we could see a little bit of it in better detail. In the original, it's a bit further out and runs more parallel to this area. Though in the original, it's also not in a perfectly straight path, with the segment furthest to the right being at an angle as well. And here we have an interesting addition to the tutorial. Instead of having an opening that we simply walk off of, we now have a barrier to vault over, with a new message explaining the vaulting mechanic. Vaulting isn't something that was explained in the original, and a lot of players didn't know it existed. You would often find players doing things like rolling off of stairs to reach a Strava, when they could have just hopped over the wall.
That was a bold jump. A surprise indeed.
It was mentioned in the original game's manual, but forcing players to encounter it in-game is the better way of handling it. This is something that developers were experimenting with in the original, but for whatever reason it was scrapped. In the prototype version of the game, we find a solid but slightly shorter segment of wall that can also be vaulted over. If we go out of bounds in the final version of the game, we can find a message floating off nearby. It's just far away enough that it can't be seen from within the level boundaries. It pops into view once we get a little bit closer. It doesn't have a completed message tied to it, so we can't be certain it has anything to do with the scrapped vaulting mechanic, but it's kind of suspicious being found nearby, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was originally intended for that. Looking back at the earlier wall of boxes in the prototype, there is an extra message of some kind placed near those as well, which loads automatically here. The weird part is that these boxes can also be vaulted over, unlike other boxes, so this is yet another possible candidate for where vaulting might have been explained to us. Okay, let's move on. I don't have too much to say about the courtyard below. Here's a few quick area comparisons. Here's a rooftop added to the area with the closed gate, while the original has some weird textures on top. And over here we have one of those star reliefs again, this time replaced with a more ornate glass window. An item corpse was added in this back corner that wasn't originally there. Perhaps they wanted to be generous by adding just a couple extra grasses, or maybe if you had the original game memorized, this was meant to be a reminder to continue exploring the remake, since it has a few new items throughout. Once again, here's a look over the wall and how that compares to the original. I do want to talk about the design change for the Archstone node. In a previous video, I mentioned how there's something of a hidden design in it that's hard to see on PlayStation 3, especially considering how they're all rotated differently, often obscuring these details. But it takes on the appearance of an animal's head, looking a lot like a tapir. This has since been identified by Vaati as probably intending to convey a Baku, something from Japanese mythology that devours nightmares, and he's elaborated why that might be relevant to the lore of Demon Souls. It does keep the Baku design, but at first I was a little frustrated that they changed these to have a smoldering look to them. It might be a nod to Dark Souls, making them look a bit more like bonfires now, but it loses its unique flavor. Why harken back to Dark Souls when these have an interesting and kind of alien feeling to them? I think giving them a greenish glow in the remake would have looked really cool. However, by changing the design, they might have been trying to replicate what the original did in a roundabout way. What I mean is, the original design made it hard to instantly recognize it as an animal's head due to the low resolution. On the PS5, it might have been a lot clearer, and also easier to spot with photo mode. But by making it more reminiscent of a bonfire, players coming over from Dark Souls might be tricked into dismissing the Archstone as a simple analog to the bonfire, not realizing what's unique about it. So by making it look more like something else, it loses its original aesthetic, but it might actually reinforce the goal of obscuring its design. Okay, so now I want to show something that's really cool here. We have another gate here where we can also hear those new sound effects of the Vanguard demon snarling somewhere in the distance. But how much does this make sense? Just from playing the game normally, we don't know how the maps are meant to connect. Presumably, when we use the Archstone here, it takes us inside that building ahead of us. But these are disconnected map pieces that have loading screens between them, and particularly the final area of the tutorial really feels like it's far off, somewhere else. But what if I told you that this was all designed as one cohesive area, and that it would have been very easy to convert the tutorial into one bigger level? Well, that's really how it was designed. Even though it didn't need to work this way, when you use this archstone to warp to the next area, you are being taken to the other side of this gate. When we go out of bounds, we can see another unused path behind it. This links up with the blocked off path we find behind us when we start the second area. Now, the different levels aren't loaded simultaneously, which explains why we have to go through a loading screen and why we unfortunately can't cross levels by simply going out of bounds. But to help demonstrate that these two things really are linked, I can load both maps at the same time in Dark Souls Map Studio. Here, we're going through the closed off gate at the end of the first area. Now we're in the out of bounds hallway immediately behind it, and now we're passing through that first gate that marks the entrance to the second area. Here we can go out of bounds in the second area to see how much of the hallway path is included from this side. And here's where it gets even more interesting. The second area shows a few places you can't get to. There's a closed off gate with a staircase behind it. There's a broken staircase further ahead. And there's also this area opposite from the boss, behind another closed gate. These aren't just random filler, they actually convey a cohesive design that connects back with itself. And it also connects back to that upper walkway that we had to vault down from in the first level. So this isn't just some random gate that we can't get through, it would have actually led to those out-of-bounds areas in the second level. Now there isn't that much to the out-of-bounds prototype content, it's mostly just hallways that connect to each other. Here we'll turn around from the Vanguard Demon and go through that gate that's normally blocking our path. Off to the right, there's a blocked off path, but if we teleport to the opposite side, we see that it's a hallway with a broken floor. From the beginning of the level, we can look up and see that same broken floor and inaccessible hallway. But instead of turning right upstairs, we can turn left. At the end of this hallway, we can turn right and head down some stairs. This is the same broken staircase with the wooden platform that we can see from near the beginning of the level. But instead of turning right, we can find the one unique aspect to the prototype version that's actually pretty amazing, and more than just another hallway. It's an outdoors balcony, and there's a bunch of detail here. We can see a river, mountains with trees on them, a bridge, and ruins in the distance. So we have an entire vista of distant stuff that was cut from the game. There's a bit of dissonance in both of these views, they don't totally fit together perfectly. These mountains on the right would be blocking some of the distant bridge seen from the first area. If you're wondering about the orientation of this balcony, basically if we hug the building around this side, we'd eventually get there. I'll do exactly that in the map viewer to help make sense of it. This here shows the broken bridges in the distance seen from the first area. And this shows the small segment of bridge seen from the balcony in the prototype. So they are placed very near to each other and aligned very closely, at least. Here's a closer look at the buildings on the right. Here's the broken bridge going over the river. Looking up the river, we can see that it forks. going over the bridge leads to some more ruins, and further back behind it there's an entire town of some kind. Most of it's very low resolution and just one simple texture, so it's hard to get a clear look at it in-game. But Map Studio can help give us a clearer look. There's an L-shaped wall protecting some houses and buildings behind it. Then there's a raised structure behind another wall beyond it. This one has a bit more detail, like columns placed at each corner. This is clearly some place of importance to the town below, and it has a couple towers next to it that are overlooking the river. Demon's Souls only has a small number of distant towns that can be seen, so I find it really fascinating that they put all of this effort into one that wound up getting scrapped. All for this view for a balcony that no longer exists. But we can see the remnants of paths that would have led to that balcony in the final product. Heading back to the balcony, let's continue along. From here, there's a couple ways we could go. This closed-off path on the right is simply the far end of that broken pathway with the collapsed floor that we saw earlier. This gated path on the left is the hallway that would have connected back to that upper gateway in the first level. And we also have the staircase that heads below. It takes us down to the opposite side of the closed gate we see at the beginning of the second level. There's even a lever still down here that would have been used to open this gate. It's not working for me because I didn't get every little aspect of the prototype map functioning correctly, but you can see it in Wolf's demonstration of the prototype map. Something else we can see in Wolf's demonstration is a different loading transition. With the gates opened up, we wouldn't have used an archstone to travel between the two areas. Simply running down the hallway would put us through the loading screen, and we would have been able to travel between the upper path of the levels in the same way. I'll include a link to Wolf's video in the description below. And if all these interconnecting paths weren't enough, there's also another hallway connecting the unused upper and lower entrances directly. If we go just beyond where the upper path dead ends from the prototype map in the second area, we can find it heading back down towards the beginning of the level. But it's invisible. It is here, though. I currently have gravity disabled, and I would be falling to my death if there wasn't collision for a hallway here. As seen from the first level, it would have been at the very top of the path where it ramps upwards, heading down towards the left. This missing hallway can be seen more clearly in Dark Souls Map Studio. And that's not all. We also have the Dragon God area. This feels like somewhere completely separate and random, but it also connects as one big map. If we go out of bounds behind the Vanguard Demon in the normal version of the level, we'll find a small patch of ground that looks like it could be the entrance to a cave. If we go out of bounds behind the entrance of the Dragon Gods area, we'll find an unused cave path that slopes upwards. The prototype version of the map shows us the cave still intact behind the boss, this time behind a gated entrance instead of having a solid wall behind it. And once again, a flythrough in Map Studio removes any shred of uncertainty about the direct connectivity of these different maps. Where does that put the Dragon God in relation to the first area? We might have to suspend our disbelief a little, in that it's hard to imagine that massive lavascape not being too far around the corner. But to be fair, the map viewer shows us that it's back and to the left in this direction. This view is properly obscured by these rock walls, which explains why they're out here in the first place. It's not just a bunch of random rocks. They're here to simplify the area's design, so they wouldn't have had to work harder to show distant scenery that would work with the Dragon Gods area. Okay, that was a pretty big tangent about the layout of the tutorial, but that was hopefully news to most viewers. For Demon's Souls, I can't really do the same kind of world layout analysis that I've done for Dark Souls 1 and 3 so far, because of how everything is disconnected here. But From Software manages to throw us yet another geographical surprise by making the interconnectivity of the tutorial way more cohesive than I think anyone would have guessed. Okay, back to some normal area comparisons. Before moving on to the next area, I wanted to quickly demonstrate some of the enhancements to the ambient audio. As you progress through an area, there's more variety from moment to moment. Walking through this passage, we may dislodge some arrows stuck into our surroundings that weren't there in the original version of the game. Sometimes corpses will be surrounded by flies that are buzzing about. There's also some off-screen environmental events, stuff that isn't part of the looping background audio. Earlier I showed the Vanguard herd killing someone in the distance, but another event is found in this hallway. When we reach this particular spot, we hear a crow get startled and fly off. I think the implication is one saw us through the new opening they added in the wall. All of these little details make the remake sound fantastic, particularly with a decent pair of headphones. Okay, now moving on to the second area, now known as the Forlorn Outpost. The same out-of-bounds areas are hinted at here in the remake as well. It is missing the broken hallway above, but the rest are still here. The added doors obscure our view a little. I was trying to see if it still contained the unreachable lever back there on the left, but we wouldn't be able to tell from here. They did add a completely new doorway along this wall though, and carefully moving the camera around allows us to just barely see where I think the lever should be, and since we can't see it, I do think it was probably removed for the remake. I didn't comment on it before when we were in here, but this room has a unique set piece inside, which are these barrels resting inside a storage nook inside the walls. I just find it interesting that you can barely notice it in the original, but it's reminiscent of things that got added back into the remake elsewhere. The object placement inside the room is identical in the remake as well, and these objects are also breakable with projectiles. They did flesh out some of the surrounding ruins, and that's pretty cool to see. In the original, we can see that there's nothing back here, and here's what it looks like now. There is also an added hallway down below. Let's move on. Again, I find it fascinating to think about how that unused balcony and distant scenery of the prototype would be just beyond that door up there. The Blue-Eye Knight found here is standing in some rubble in both versions. However, in the original, the rubble was placed between its legs. The remake seizes the opportunity to instead put some rubble underneath its foot, which puts the enemy into a much cooler looking stance. This is something they could have easily done in the original, as the inverse kinematics make it happen automatically. It's not like they have to create a different idling animation for this. Though the remake does also add a bunch of new idling animations, but I'll save that for the next episode. Up above, we'll find that the roof of this hallway is broken open in a similar way. But in the original, you'll see a recessed patch of ceiling that could have held more bricks, and I believe this was originally intended to be a possible death trap. In the prototype version, you can see more bricks tucked in up there, and in Wolf's run-through, you can see them fall from the ceiling properly. It doesn't look that deadly in his demonstration, but there is an unused cutscene of the player getting crushed here. The cutscene ends abruptly, but I believe you can hear the beginning of the player's death sound effect. Perhaps in the same way that there's more to this area if you can get past the Vanguard demon, they might have wanted you to be able to die here even earlier, allowing for a couple extra points of progression. I think there's something else that might back this up, but I'll talk more about that later. Going up the stairs here, we have a wall that was opened up to contain some large wooden casks. And throughout the game, we also get a lot of extra corpses in the environment. And once again, there's more storage space nearby. Up the stairs, a fireplace was added. And this is one of those times where the walkable space was modified just a little bit to accommodate the new visuals, where it was previously more of a flat wall. I don't know why, but I find it interesting that these objects remained completely identical for some reason. They might look like kind of a random structure, but they did have a purpose. They were built to hang meat from, which goes along with the boiling stew in the next room. What happened to the meat, you ask? Well, we can't see what's in the stew in the original. Maybe it's just some tomato soup. In the remake, we can see it was stuffed with rats, which is pretty cool. But surely something bigger was hanging from these chains at some point, and the bloodstains on the floor make it look like something bigger was dragged around here. We can find some answers in Dark Souls Map Studio, which reveals some cut content. Here we have a human corpse hanging, awaiting preparation for consumption. It's pretty macabre, and shows what the soul-starved humans are willing to eat. But it's also a bit cliché. Sure, cannibalism is spooky and all, but couldn't they have come up with something cooler and surprising? Oh. Yeah, so there was originally going to be an alligator over here. There's an unused character model for an alligator, but it doesn't have any animations. It's been known of for a long time. I believe it was first discovered by Gibbed, when he was the first to demonstrate cut enemy models all those years back. But I'm just now realizing that there's this corresponding object file and where it was going to be placed. Along the outside, we can see some new distant hallways that didn't previously exist. I would love to be able to explore out of bounds in the remake to see all of that more closely. I think this hallway might essentially be a copy and paste of the other new hallway we saw down below earlier. If we try to lift the camera through the hole in the ceiling back in this room, we'll hit an invisible wall, but at the right angle you can see some weird shadowing or texture issues up there. And we can lift the camera a little higher than I was expecting in the soup room to see a little bit more of the surrounding rooftop structures. Opposite from the boss, we're back at the forking path of the prototype. If we crank the brightness up in photo mode, we can see that there's still two passages where they would have been. And here's something I found interesting. It might just be a coincidence, but it was the path on the right that was fully blocked, the one that would have led to that hallway with the broken floor. That gate is fully closed here. It was the path on the left that was open and led towards the balcony. And while it does have a closed door now, the gate itself is open, unlike the gate on the right. So it might be a nod to which one of these paths would have been accessible originally. In the room before the Vanguard Demon, there's quite a bit of extra detail with the chandeliers and the ornate chairs along the walls. Both the remake and the original have holes in the ceiling here, though the placement was different and it was smaller in the original. In the original game, it's another remnant of where the ceiling was previously designed to collapse on you. And the staircase heading up to the boss is now lined with statues. There's 5 different statues here, so there's a good amount of detail. One of them appears to be of a crowned woman holding a child. Let's talk about fog. Of course, the fog effect is much more detailed, and I like the way it flows along the ground. But it's become much more opaque. You can no longer see the boss through it. Something I liked about Demon's Souls fog gates is how they were pretty transparent, always giving you at least a fuzzy glance at what's on the other side. Perhaps that ruins the element of surprise in some situations, but I always thought the solid fog gates of Dark Souls managed to look worse, and they were less aesthetically pleasing than what Demon's Souls had. They sort of split the difference here. They're not completely opaque, and there's a little bit of transparency for things that are very close to the fog gate. But otherwise you can't see much at all, unless you go into photo mode to lift the camera higher, where the fog is thinner. I think it looks pretty cool like this, and it's how I would have liked the thickest part of the fog to have looked. Okay, now onto the boss. This is one of those cases where I feel like less is more, and I'm definitely a bigger fan of the original design. Yes, it's a bit goofier, but I'm reminded of that often quoted segment from the Dark Souls Design Works book, where director Hidetaka Miyazaki discusses his preference to steer away from grotesque designs. To be perfectly fair about the Vanguard Demon, it was a reused asset from a previous From Software game called Enchanted Arms, where it was originally named Debrad. It underwent some minor tweaking for Demon's Souls, but was largely unchanged. So being something of a copy and paste in the first place, I don't think its original design was super carefully considered or anything. But the end result was something more alien and somehow more dignified. One major difference is how it doesn't look wounded or sickly in the original. In the remake there's skin worn down on its knuckles, and it has weird growths and deformations of the skin that make it look like it would be unhealthy by the standards of whatever its original anatomy would be. Its face makes angrier expressions, where the original can't emote very much and looks a bit indifferent about the situation. And something kind of out of left field, they did add a mouth to the back of it. This I don't mind nearly as much, because it's a pretty big random thing to change, and it does feel like something that From Software might have done. There's a cut Demon's Souls enemy that was intended for the Broken Archstone area, that was basically a Yeti with a mouth in its belly. But overall, they lean towards making this boss more aggressive and scary looking, and I feel like this design would have been more appropriate for something like Doom. I've also heard some people complain about the chains and shackles that were added on, now indicating that it was a prisoner at some point. This is actually one aspect I can get behind, but I'll save the discussion for when we meet the second one in the Shrine of Storms. I don't know how deep I'm going to get into the music for this series, but I feel like some themes get a bit muddied and lost at times when they're put into these larger orchestrations that have more nuance to them. So at times I really find myself wishing the game allowed the option of using the original soundtrack. But it's not all bad, and this theme in particular starts off very faithful and lasts that way for a good while. You can sync things up to play both versions at the same time, and they actually sound shockingly good together. I didn't even have to beat match anything, they're the exact same tempo. We lose the timpani's sort of incessant quarter note pulse in favor of a softer eighth note pattern on a snare drum. Despite being a simple change for the percussion, I feel like this is the biggest change in personality between the two tracks. To highlight a positive of the new soundtrack, I like the variation of this section where the strings go crazy. Anyways, here's a few more measures of both versions playing together because it sounds so good. Okay, now onto the next area. When we survive the fight, we of course wind up at the final, optional part of the tutorial, which is now named Unknown Egress. Unlike the original, they actually put a door behind us this time, which helps reinforce the idea that this could be connected to the previous area in some way. I tried raising the camera over the wall to see if any of the sloped path behind it remained intact. It doesn't look like it, but we also can't see much. I should also mention that they've adjusted the really over-the-top screen shake that the original has. The screen now only shakes when you're closer to the Dragon God. They also made it so that a bit of rubble shakes loose each time the dragon breathes. In the original, you can see similar small bits of rubble on the ground, but none of it actively gets shaken loose, so I appreciate how the remake picked up on this design element and turned it into something dynamic. They also added an effect where the air and smoke is pushed by the Dragon God's breath. The general idea of being deep in some crevice remains intact, though they removed some architecture like the outer walls and replaced them with cave walls. And also the weird arch that feels kind of random and out of place in the original, that was removed as well. A new item was added here called the Iron Helm. It better matches the helmet from the original fluted set. Object placement is mostly the same, boxes with one barrel on the left, and just two boxes over here on the right. And the skeleton corpses look very similar to the original as well. Overall, things feel opened up a bit more. The path is now lined with iron fences we can see through, and sconces are moved off the floor and into the columns. We do lose this sort of design pattern from the architecture, and get these instead. Here we can get our first clear look at the Dragon God. Here's a side-by-side comparison. I don't really have anything specific to say about any design changes. It looks really cool to me in both versions. Here's a random kind of design detail about the Dragon God that you might have not noticed, but he actually has 6 fingers and toes. And they kept that the same in the remake. Inside here, we can see a statue that's not here in the original game, but that doesn't mean it's entirely new. The statues are based on some out-of-bounds content that we can just barely see in the original. We can't see them clearly at all unless we cheat to get closer, so I find it really cool that they decided to keep these and make them more prominent. Something else very strange out here is a structure that's hidden out of view behind the Dragon God. We can normally never see it from any vantage point, but with a bit of cheating, we can kill him off. So it's straight back there. I've tried to look very carefully around the Dragon God in the remake to see if we can see part of the structure at all. I suspect it's probably not there anymore, but it could still just be blocked from view. Perhaps we'll find out when the PS5 inevitably gets hacked some years in the future. It's a really strange set piece with unique shapes and textures we don't find anywhere else in the game. It's pretty weird they put this effort into something we can't see at all, and it has more detail than you'd expect for something this far in the distance. I also find it pretty strange that there's a couple Blistai out there. I mean, it kind of makes sense. Thematically, it ties in with how we fight it later. But these are different. Instead of being these simple weird magic ones from Stonefang, these ones are a lot more detailed. And they even had animations made for them. Once again, that's a lot of effort for something that's entirely out of bounds, which all points to an obvious conclusion. This isn't just thematically similar to the Dragon God encounter later, but I believe it's likely a scrapped prototype version of that fight. They must have been demoing the concept for themselves here, and they had the bigger ideas down. The dragon watches you from behind some columns, you use a couple Blistai to kill it, and it punches you. But then the next step of the design dictated that it can't just be an easy walk from one ballista to the other. So the same concepts are adapted to a wider obstacle course. And at some point it made more sense to develop that for a different level instead of continuing here. Again, this is all just speculation, but it would make all the extra detail make sense. I wouldn't be surprised if someone made this set piece with the expectation that it was something to be encountered after defeating the boss. This is something I said I'd talk more about earlier. Remember the unused early death cutscene? If you could die earlier in the tutorial originally, then also having more content afterwards makes sense as well. I mean, having all these extra progress points would be very convoluted if your expectation is to just die and wind up in the Nexus. But what if that wasn't always the case? I think there's a possibility that Demon's Souls was a very different game much earlier in development. I mean, we do know that was the case, but we don't have a lot of specifics on what was going wrong. What we do know, from an interview with the director, is that Sony wanted something to compete with the Elder Scrolls series. Oblivion was a very big deal at the time, and they approached From Software because they envisioned them being able to steer Kingsfield in that direction. But things didn't go according to plan. Demon's Souls was not doing well. The project had issues, and the team had been unable to make a compelling prototype. Could you imagine Sony wanting to see something that reminded them of Oblivion in some way? And then From Software completely drops the ball by making something that's weirdly Dragon's Lair-esque in a way. Now, I'm not suggesting that Demon's Souls was just going to be a series of QuickTime events, or that it wasn't going to be an action RPG, but it does appear to me like it was originally leaning harder into scripted events, with an emphasis on avoiding a series of deadly obstacles. Don't let the ceiling crush you. Don't die to this boss. Don't get punched by the dragon, etc. We do know that there was a cut permadeath mode, known in the data as True Death. We don't know exactly how it would have functioned, but it involved losing all of your stats and gear if you died in ghost form. Initially the plan was to have the game feature permadeath, where the death of a character would result in the save file being erased. Of course, we all agreed that we probably went too far with that. The cut content described something a little less harsh than that. It didn't say your entire save file would be deleted, but it described something more like a roguelike that would de-level you and take gear away. But it would start you right back up. We can kind of picture this functioning in the final game, but if that was a design concept from the start, a more Dragon's Lair-ish try not to die type of game really seems like it could have been a previous consideration. What do you think? Am I speculating too much? Maybe, but at least I have a more specific hypothesis on how this game was shaping up in its earliest stages, before Miyazaki-san took over and drastically overhauled the project. And regardless of how it evolved exactly, it's still fascinating how Sony kind of made a mistake when partnering with From Software. They didn't deliver the kind of game they wanted, and the project was on the verge of cancellation mid-development. Shuhei Yoshida, the former president of Sony Worldwide Studios, is famously on the record for really not liking Demon's Souls the first time he experienced it. For my personal experience with Demon's Souls, when it was close to final, I spent close to 2 hours playing it, and after 2 hours, I was still standing at the beginning of the game. I said, this is crap. This is an unbelievably bad game, so I put it aside. But he said all of this not to crap on the game, this all was part of an admission that they screwed up. We definitely dropped the ball from a publishing standpoint, including studio management side. We were not able to see the value of the product we were making. And what's really cool about the turnaround here is that I have zero doubt that it's 100% authentic. I don't think this is just a hollow PR statement after the success of Dark Souls. For Bloodborne promotion, Yoshida-san fought the Watchdog on more than one occasion. Demonstrating a ton of skill in this first promo, but failing to win, he followed it up with a stream of a successful win. You absolutely would not go through all of that just to feign a respect for the series. For something that was initially a big disappointment, here we are now with Demon's Souls as a PS5 launch title. It's quite the redemption story, and I find it pretty great that we have this remake in addition to the original. For those who have stronger opinions about some of the design changes, I get it, and future episodes will have me nitpicking some more stuff I really didn't like. But for me, no matter how strongly I feel about a handful of particular changes, this is still a game that has a great overall experience, and it certainly feels like more than the sum of those parts. Hopefully PS5s will be easier to get in the near future, so more people can experience this for themselves. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing. I had a blast making this, and I can't wait to pour over the rest of the game. I'd like to thank Wolf2K, Meow Maritus, and Dropoff for their assistance in getting the prototype version of the tutorial working. And also Rick Gibbed, for releasing the debug mode of Demon Souls, which is incredibly helpful for every video I make about this game. And I'd like to give a shout out to Grimrook and Batsley Adams for additional assistance. And also thank you to everyone who supports me on Patreon. Any support goes a long way towards helping this channel. We just recently met the goal for creating the second Dark Souls video screensaver, so if you'd like some input on which area is done next, I've opened the poll for $5 backers and above. But that poll will close after this video has been up for a week. And lastly, an extra special thanks to my backers at the Evil Vagrant tier. Alex the Bear, Astranicus, Curtis Ware, Gary Marshall, Harry Pham, Carl Germ, Lou DeFrago, Nashwan Azari, Nate Hines, Patrick Conroy, Pethris, Stuart Rice, Majalis Duo, and Zelther. Thanks again for watching.